Today we're going to create this website together in HTML and CSS. We have this landing page with a laptop animation. We also have our logo right here, as well as a navigation bar. Once clicking on the nav item, you can basically navigate the page by doing so. Right below our header, we have this card section that includes a lot of icons with a heading as well as some text. Below our card section, we have another card section that displays the plans that this imaginary website offers. And once hovering over these plans, you can basically flip between a front and a back page for every single card element. You also have a team section for our website, which displays all of the team members of this page. Right below, we have a contact form where you can basically type in your name, a topic, as well as a message in case you wanted to message or contact the company. We also have the send message button to submit the form. And at the bottom of this page, we have this footer, which includes a lot of links as well as information that doesn't fit to the main content and belongs to the footer. So let's get started, guys. Let me show you how to create this cool landing page. You basically have your logo, you have a navigation bar where you can hover, you have a floating laptop as well as some information about your company, for example, and you have some socials at the left bottom. So let's get started, guys. Let's start by creating our index.html, and inside of this index.html we are going to generate a basic template. We are going to say that this is our home page, and we create a header, a main section, as well as a footer. Divide our page into different subsections. Now we can open our website with the live server, and this is what it looks like. Now let's also create a style.css, and let's link our style sheet to our HTML file by using link:/CSS, and now we have href to our CSS file, and this should work now. So let's go inside of our style sheet and use the universal selector and use a margin of 0, a padding of 0, and let's use box sizing of border box as well. Now let's also target our header, and let's say our header has a background that is equal to a radial gradient or a couple of radial gradients. Feel free to just copy those colors in if you want to. It would take a lot of testing, so I'm not going to type them out entirely. But we are also going to say that we want to have a width of 100% for the header and a height of 100% of the viewport height. And now it basically looks like this. So this is our background for now. Let's get started by creating our navigation bar. So inside of our header, we are going to create a div, and inside of this div, we'll have our navigation bar, and we have one logo at the left. So we'll create another div, and we say that we have a paragraph that says logo, for example. And now we have another div, which is our navigation bar, and inside of this navigation bar, we will have different anchor tags which represent our sections. So we will say that we have a that goes to home, for example. Then we have another anchor that goes to web development like so, and then the next one goes to team, for example, and the last one goes to content. So now we have those anchor tags right here. Now it's getting time to style them, and I will use a lot of object-oriented CSS, and you'll see what I mean by doing so in a couple of seconds. So I'm going to define a class that says .flex, and that class will set the display to flex. Now I will also define a class .gap1 that will create a gap of maybe 10 pixels. So now I will use the class of flex for my nav bar, and now we will have a flex box right here, and I will also use gap1, and now we should have a gap between our items. And this is basically object-oriented CSS, so I basically write the classes, and now I can reuse the classes over and over again if I want to create a flexbox, for example. So let's say I also want to create a flexbox right here to use flex for our logo and for our nav bar. And now I basically have flex right here as well. Now I'm also going to create a .white class that sets the color to white, and I'll also give this white class to all of my anchor tags for now. So I'm going to copy this line right here. Maybe I'm also going to use ._none to create text decoration of none, and then I'm going to copy _none and give the class to our anchor tag as well. And now I'm going to copy this class right here because this is basically how I want our anchors to look like, and I'm going to use that one, and that one for now. And this is what it looks like. And I'm also going to create .font large, which is basically going to have a font size of, let's try 40 pixels for now, and I'm going to give my logo the class of font minus large. And now we have this big logo text right here, which doesn't look too good, so I'm going to use white as well, and I'm going to create another class that says .bold, and that one is obviously going to have font weight of bold. So now I can give that one the class of bold as well, and now we have this logo text right here, which still doesn't look too good. Maybe we should also work on using a different font size, and in order to do so we are going to incorporate a different font, and we're going to Google fonts and we are going to search for Roboto, for example. But obviously you can choose whatever font suits your needs, but I really think Roboto might fit to this project. So I'm going to go to get embedded code. I'll basically copy those link tags right here, and I'm going to paste them into the header of our style sheet. Now I'll also use this line here, and I'm going to copy this one, which says font family Roboto sans serif, and I'm going to say inside of our body tag, which doesn't exist yet, so we're going to create the body tag. We say everything inside of our body uses font family Roboto sans serif. And now once we go to our website, we basically have Roboto right here. Right below our flexbox, I'm also going to create a class that says .justify between, and this class will have justify content of space between. So we're going to copy this class and we give this class to our flexbox at the top to basically create space between those items. And you'll see what it looks like in a second. So we are going to use this class, and now we have the space between our navigation bar and our logo. And the next thing we can do is create a line item center. So we're going to use .items minus center, and we say this one has a line items of center. And now if I use items center right here as well, the items should be centered as well. And as you can see, they are. Now it would also be kind of cool to have some form of margin or padding, in our case margin around our logo and margin around our navigation bar. So I'm going to create, let's use .m2 for example, because maybe we want to have m1 later on, and let's say we want to create margin of 20 pixels in all directions, and now we're going to use m2 for our logo as well as our navigation bar. And now we have this margin. Maybe margin isn't the best property, so we're going to create P2 as well, which will obviously work for padding instead of margin. And now we use P2 for this tag instead of margin 2. And now we have this effect. Obviously, I think it's probably a little bit too much, and it's not enough on the left and on the right, and it's too much on the top. So I'm going to use, or I'm going to generate the class P2 PY2, which is basically for the y-axis, and I'm going to say, let's create margin top of 20 pixels, margin bottom of 20 pixels, and now I'm going to create .px3 for example, and I'm going to say this one, or let's say 4, and let's say this one has a margin right of 40 pixels and a margin left of 40 pixels. So I'm going to use PY2 and PX4. So now I basically have, I used margin instead of padding, that was my bad, so obviously we need to use padding for PX, and we're going to replace margin right here, and now we have this effect, which looks actually already a lot better in my opinion. So the next thing we can basically do is also create a bigger gap for the items, because I think this is like definitely not enough. So I'm going to copy and paste this one. I'm going to create gap 3, and I'm going to say, yeah, this one has 30 pixels for example. And now we obviously need to use gap 3 instead of gap 1 right here. And now we basically have a bigger gap. Maybe I'm going to use 40 pixels though, because I think 40 pixels looks a little bit better. Yeah. And this is what it looks like. So now we have this kind of website. Obviously we will style our navigation bar slightly different later on, or maybe we can do it just right now. Okay, for now, let's say this one goes to the index.html, and we'll see what we are going to do with the other hrefs later on. But for now, let's say this one goes to index.html, And now I obviously want to target inside of our navbar every anchor tag that has an href equal to input.html, like so. And I want to say this one has a background of white. Maybe I had a typo in here, so I'm going to copy this one. I'm going to say I want to copy this one, and now we have this effect. Yeah, maybe it was just a typo. So now we have this background. Obviously it doesn't look too good, so maybe I'm going to replace this gap 3 with gap 1, and now I'll give every class a px of 4 as well, for example, so we have some more padding in the x direction, and now it looks like this. Now let's also maybe use, we have py2, so let's also use py2 for the individual items by doing so. And now we should have this effect basically, but I think py2 is probably a little bit too much, so we are going to create py of 1, which just has a padding top and bottom of 10 pixels. So now I'm going to replace the 2 with the 1 by doing so, and now we have this effect. Now I also want to have a border radius, and for this element I want to have a color of black for the text, obviously, because this one is the selected one. And I also want to use a border radius of 15 pixels. And let's just say we want to use 30 pixels, so we really have rounded corners. And now we have this effect. So the selected page is basically looking like this, and all of the other pages are looking like this. And now we can also use a hover effect. So let's say we are just going to copy the exact same effect. So let's make it like this. Let's say nav a:hover, and now we have the same effect once we hover. So once we hover over these elements, you can see this is what it looks like. And obviously you could adjust this according to your needs. And now maybe also like make this text a little bit shorter, because yeah, it doesn't look too good. And now we have this effect basically. And in my opinion, this looks pretty cool already. So now that we have our navigation bar, let's keep going. First of all, let's say, okay, this one, bam bam, is our comment, and this is our navigation, just to keep track of what we're doing. So let's copy this comment, and down below our navigation div we'll create, this is our PC section, and here we will have an animation. So let's start by creating another container, and inside of this container we'll use an image, and that image is basically our laptop. So we're going to go into our images folder, which I'll also provide in the description. So we're going into images, and we say, let's take our laptop.png, we create an alt of laptop. And once we open the site, you can see that we have this laptop, which obviously looks terrible. So let's go ahead and create 2 more sections. One is a section that has an h2 that says what we offer, for example. And then it has a short paragraph that has a couple of words, maybe like 20 words. I don't know, doesn't really matter. Maybe that's a little bit, yeah, maybe that's not enough, but we can, yeah, add words later on. And now we are just going to copy the exact same container, and we paste the exact same container below our image. So now we give this container, our first container, we give it the class of maybe animation wrapper. And then we are going to target this animation wrapper. We say that this one has a flex box as well. We're going to use justify between, like so. And then we'll say that we want to have items center as well. And now you can see we basically have this effect. Still doesn't look too good, but it will look pretty good in a couple of seconds. Maybe we can also say that we want to use, instead of justify between, we can also maybe just copy this line. We say justify round instead of between. And here we obviously want to use space around instead of space between. So we are going to copy this class and we paste it in here, and now we have space around our items. Obviously still doesn't look much better, but it's kind of right. Obviously for this class we can also say we want to use class white, as well as for the paragraph we are going to use class white. And now we have this effect already. Looks a lot better, still not perfect. So let's go and start styling our laptop, which will have the class of laptop. And now we're going to target this laptop class. We have to, dot laptop for now. And we give our laptop a width of 40%, for example. And maybe that is still too big, so we're going with 30%, and that might be kind of right. Let's go with 27, and this looks kind of right to me. So next up, let's go and also add an animation to our laptop, and we can do so by going to add keyframes identifier, which will be float in our circumstance, and we are going to create some keyframes at 0%, and we'll also add some keyframes at 25%. We'll add some more keyframes at 50%, 75, and 100. So we're going to type 100 right here. Then we're going to say that these ones are 50% and those ones are 75%. And now we obviously want to rotate our laptop slightly. So we're going to use transform, and we're going to use rotate of maybe, let's say 2 degrees. So 2 degrees is our starting value. And now it looks like this. Looks a little bit better in my opinion already, but yeah, definitely some work to do. So let's also add an H1 above our page right here. And let's say H1 says web development. Obviously this could just be the company name or whatever you basically want. Let's say we also want to create a font XXL, for example, right below our font large. Let's say dot font XXL, and we have a font size of 80 pixels. Let's also create a class dot center that makes text align center basically. So let's use font XXL for our web development header, font minus XXL, and let's use white, and let's use text minus center. And now we have those effects basically. And I think it was just center, that's why the text isn't centered. And now we have this effect. Obviously some margin would be pretty cool as well, so I create a class that has mt.mt4, for example, and we say we want to have a margin top of 40 pixels, for example. And now we are going to use mt4 on our h1. So let's use mt4. We are going to save the document. And I think this is like still, definitely not enough. So I'm going to create mt8. Let's use mt8 and let's create 80 pixels. Let's say mt8 is going to be used right here, and that's a little bit better. I still would say could experiment with the margin, but it looks pretty alright to me. So the next thing we want to do is add an animation to our laptop, and we're going to do so by creating a float animation. So first of all, we obviously might want to create some more space right here. So we can, for example, say that we want to have a translate Y property of maybe 50 or 60 pixels, doesn't really matter too much. So we have 60 pixels right here, but I think 40 would probably look slightly better. And now we have this effect, and now it looks pretty good to me. And we are going to go ahead and create an animation for our transform property. So we're going to copy this property in here, and let's say we want to go from our base value to maybe 0 within the first 25% of our animation, and let's say we want to go to maybe, let's say 0 degrees. Then we are going to go upwards again to maybe 40 pixels, and we're going to go to -2 degrees though. Then let's say we copy this one again, and we are going, or let's say we are going to -3 degrees here. And then let's copy this one again. Let's say we are going to translate to maybe 0 pixels once again, and we're going to go to 1 degree. And as a last step, we might just go back to our initial transformation by copy and pasting this one. So now we are going to use this float animation for our laptop by using animation. We'll use the name float. We use a duration of maybe 20 seconds, a timing function that could, for example, be ease in out, a delay of 0, an iteration count of infinite, and we can delete the last two properties. And now we're going to save this, and we have this floating effect. And obviously this one is a super simple effect. You can obviously create cooler animations by having more rotation or more changes in rotations, for example, which would actually make it probably look a little more dynamic, but I don't want to bore you for hours by typing the same animations out. So the next thing we are going to do is create a container that just contains 80% of the entire space. So it doesn't go from left to right, but rather stays somewhat centered, if you want to say so. And the first thing I'm going to do so is create .v80, so a class that uses 80% of the width, and we're going to say let's use 80% of the width. And I'm going also to create, this should be fine for now. It's probably smarter to create another wrapper right here, which is a div. I'm going to copy and paste everything inside, and I'm going to create v class of v80. So this one takes up 80% of the available space now, and I'm going to use flex, and I'm going to use justify center. And I'm not sure if I've created this class yet. I don't think I have. So we're going to create justify center, and we use justify content of center. And now we can use this class, copy and paste this one, and we're going to go and replace justify center with justify center. But maybe we don't even need v80, to be honest. Instead, we are going to justify this content in the center, but obviously this content should not take up 100% of the width, so this should work. So now this container basically takes up 80% of the available space, and this container here justifies the content, so the 80% inside of in the center, if you want to say so, if that makes sense. So I'm also going to create a gap between the items right here and say I want to have gap of, I don't know what kind of values I've defined already. So I'm going to take a look. Gap of 3 would be possible, for example. So let's say gap 3. And now we have this gap between our laptop and the other items. But I think maybe I'm going to give my laptop slightly more size. So I'm going to laptop, I say, let's use 35% for the laptop, and now it looks like this. And I think this looks a little bit cooler already. So now I want to style this and this section basically. So I'm going to go into my second section. I'm going to start with the first section, and I say that my first section will also have a text align. I'm going to create dot left, for example, or text left, and I say text align is left, and I'm going to create dot text right, and so I say text align is right. So now I'm going to copy text left, and let's say I want to have this class centered to the left, which is already the case, so I don't really need a class, and the first one should be centered to the right, or should be aligned to the right, to be precise. So I'm going to use text right, and I'm going to save this, and I'm going to use text right for the paragraph as well. And now we have this effect. So this one is at the right, and this also is aligned to the right, and this one is aligned to the left. So maybe I can also use class white right here and class white right here, and maybe I can also say I want to use empty of, let's see what kind of margin tops we have. We only have 8, so let's use empty of 2 maybe, and let's say that one has 20 pixels, and let's add M2, which is probably too much in my opinion, I don't know, but we'll see in a second. So we're going to save the document. The mistake is obviously that I need to give the M2 to my paragraph, and now we have this effect. But to me it looks like it's a little bit too much, so I'm going to create MT of 1, and I'd say 10 pixels, and this might look a little bit better. So we're going to replace M2 with M1, and let's do the same with our second paragraph. And now we already have this effect. Let's also use an underline for our container basically, and let's say, yeah, okay, this paragraph, let's give this paragraph a class, or let's give this heading a class of, let's say, animation heading minus heading, and let's copy this heading basically, and let's say dot animation heading colon after, content is empty, display is block, width is probably 40%, height is 4 pixels, background is white. And now let's take a look at our document. So we basically have this effect already. Obviously for our animation heading, let's say right, because this one is aligned, or let's say the left one, because it's the left one, I thought because it's aligned to the right, but let's say, yeah, it's the left heading, so we're going to use this class. We're going to copy and paste this class. We're going to give this class to our left animation heading, and now we have this effect. Obviously a little bit too much, so I'm going to use 25% for the width, and I'm going to use position relative for our animation heading left, so I can use position absolute for animation heading left after element, and now I can say let's align this one to the right and give it a gap of 0. So now we have this effect. Maybe this is still like a little bit too long, so let's go with 18%, and now we have this effect. And I think this looks kind of cool, especially if, yeah, this text would be a little bit longer. Now we could also say that we want to have a margin top of 2, because I think some spacing looks a little bit cooler. And let's say that we want to have, what can we offer you right here? So now we have this text. I think it would look cooler if we have 25% now and a margin top of maybe 5 pixels as well. And I think it would be maybe, let's go to 30%, and let's say we have a height of 3 pixels. So now we have this effect. And I think this looks pretty cool to me. So we're going to do the same for our other element, which is going to be our animation heading right, and right as well here. And now we'll have a same amount of width, but we're going to start at the left basically. And now we're going to copy and paste this class to our second heading, like so. And now we should have this effect. And we could, for example, we could just go ahead and copy and paste this container once again, because this might make it a little bit easier. So we're going to copy and paste it. Now we are going to use animation heading right here, obviously. And we are also going to remove text right, and we're going to remove text right, and now it should look pretty good. So now we have the exact same effect. Obviously you can use different text for the left and for the right, but that's obviously up to you. The next thing we want to do is add some socials to the bottom, and maybe I want to have some more margin right here. So let's say I'm going to create a new margin class, which is probably even going to be margin top of 10. So we use a margin top of 100 pixels, and we replace this one with margin top of 10. So now we have this effect. And to me, this looks pretty cool. So let's go ahead and select or create an icon section. And in order to do so, we are going to use this comment again to separate our sections, to keep track of what we already have. And we'll say this is our socials icon section. So now let's get some icons. Let's go to Google and search for SVG icons. Now we are just going to SVG repo, but you can get your icons from basically any place you want. Right here we can say we want to have Instagram. So I'm going to download Instagram. I'm also going to get YouTube, for example. So I'm also going to download YouTube right here, and I'm going to download Discord. And I'm going to download this one right here. So now I have those 3 icons. I'm going to take them and I'm going to paste them inside of my images folder. So I have Discord SVG, I have this Instagram SVG, and I'm going to have this YouTube SVG. Obviously, it would be pretty good to go here and use built-in text editor, just copy and paste those icons. But to me, this is like a lot of wasted code that would make you basically lose track of the important code. So I'm just going to use the image tag because it's a lot shorter. So let's use image source. We're going to go into images and we say we want to have Instagram. Next thing we want to have is basically, let's say YouTube, and the last icon we want to have is our Discord icon. Now we can use an alt text of Instagram, YouTube, and Discord basically. So now we have this icon section, if you want to say. So now we'll give every single icon the class of icon. We're going to copy and paste this class to our other two elements, and let's go into our style shield and start to style our .icon class. So obviously my icons are black right now and I have to use a little trick to get them white, but we can do so by using brightness of 0 and invert of 1. And now our icons should be white. And as you can see, they are. Let's use a width of 40 pixels, a height of 40 pixels, for example. But it should actually be enough to use the width. And let's also say we want to have an opacity of maybe 0.4, so they are slightly opaque, and yeah, maybe even give them a width of 30%. Now we also want to create a container for our icons, obviously. So I'm going to create an icon container. Inside of this icon container I have the icons. Inside of this icon container, for our icon container, let's use position absolute. And since our icon container is a child of our header, we need to set position relative to our header, which has a height of 100 viewport height. So once we go down here and we set bottom to 0, it should appear at the bottom, as you can see. So let's say we want to have some margin to the left and to the right, if you want to say so. So we set left and bottom to 20 pixels maybe. Now we could also go ahead and use flex right here and gap of 3, for example. So now we have a little gap, but that gap is probably a little bit too much, so we use gap 1, and now we have this effect. Obviously it also makes sense to put those images inside of an anchor tag. And you can obviously define any path you want for this anchor tag. Doesn't really make too much of a difference. But yeah, obviously you could link your Instagram whatsoever right here. So we're going to do the same for our Discord icon tag as well. And now we have those 3 icon tags that should be clickable, if you want to say so. And this is basically all you need to do to create this kind of website inside of HTML and CSS. Today I show you how to create a section like this one in HTML and CSS. And this section is also 100% responsive, which means it will look good on pretty much every device and even on mobile. So let's go. So let's go inside of our main section and let's create a div wrapper in here. And let's say this div wrapper has the class of padding section, and we're going to create this class. Padding section is basically the padding we want to have on the top and the bottom. So we're going to say padding section is equal to padding top of maybe 80 pixels and a padding bottom of 80 pixels. And now we're going to add padding section to this div, and now we should have this padding at the bottom basically. So now let's add an h2 right here, and that h2 could say basically anything. It could say what you get, for example. So now we have this h2. Let's give this h2 also a class that increases the font size, and we already have this class right here that says font large or font XL, so we can choose which one we take, but I think font size of 40 pixels should be alright. So I'm going to give this h2 a class of font LG. And now we have this effect basically. Let's keep going by using the class center, I think, which will align the text inside of the center. So we're going to use this class as well. And now we have this text standard right here. So now we can start to style our different cards, if you want to say so, or our different modals, whatever you want to call them. So let's go and create a div with the class of modal, for example. And inside of this modal, we want to have an icon. On the top, we want to have a heading, for example, and then we want to have a short paragraph. So let's start by using some icons, for example. And I have some icons right here, which are basically SVG files. And in our case, we have this responsive SVG, Rocket SVG, SEO SVG, and YouTube SVG. And the best way again to add an SVG, or the most efficient way, would be to open with text editor and then just copy and paste this SVG in here, and then you would have this effect. You could obviously adjust the size by going into the width and height properties, for example, but I think this is a lot of code and it will get kind of weird or kind of hard to find the code we are looking for. So I'm going to do a way that is probably not as efficient, but it will keep our code clean just for the purpose of this demo, so you understand how everything works. So yeah, let's go inside of our image folder, and let's say we want to get our, we could for example say, let's get our responsive.svg, and we are going to save this. Now we have this SVG right here, and we can give it the class of SVG minus icon, for example. So we'll have this SVG icon. We're going inside of our style sheet and we create this class by saying dot SVG icon. This SVG icon will have a width of maybe 40 pixels. We can adjust that one later on, obviously. So maybe we are going to say, let's go with 50. And the next thing we want to have right below our image is an H3, for example, that says responsive design. And right below this responsive design, we probably want to have a paragraph with, for example, 30 words. We're going to save that one, and now everything looks like this. Obviously it doesn't look perfect, but we can change that by now saying that we want to use, for our modal, we want to use, flex. And now we also want to change flex direction. We obviously have flex right here, which just sets our container to display flex. And now we can also justify, or we can flex direction column, for example. Well, flex column is probably a shorter name. So let's use flex column for the class name, and let's say we want to have a flex direction of column, like so. Now we are going to take this flex direction, we'll place it replace it right next to flex, and we're going to save. So now we have flex direction of column. Let's now use text center. So we're going to remove text, and now we have center right here. So now we want to align our items in the center on the secondary axis, which is the row right now. So we're going to use align items of center. So I think it's align center. So yeah, we have item center, which basically aligns our items to the center. So we're going to copy and paste that class in here, and now we have our items aligned to the center. So obviously it looks completely terrible, but we're going to fix that in a second by using another wrapper for this div, basically for this modal, and we say that this is the modal minus container, and inside of this modal container we want to have 4 modals basically, but I'm going to start with 3 because we'll delete some of them anyways. So let's now keep going by using another class right next to the modal container, which is the class of grid. We need to define this class obviously, so we are going to go down and we say that we want to define a class grid that sets the display to grid. So now we basically have this design right here, and now I want to use .grid auto, which is a class I'll define, and I want to say grid template columns. I want to use repeat auto fit min max 250 pixels and 1fr function, and I'm going to use grid auto right behind grid, and this will make our design responsive. And if you can take a look at this, you'll see once we minimize the content, once it reaches a width of below 250 pixels, it will just jump down, and by doing so we now have this responsive design basically. So this line basically says repeat as many columns as you need, and once you reach a width of 250 pixels, just go to the next line, and this makes our layout responsive without having to define media query. So I really love grid, and I can recommend everyone to use grid if you want responsive design with minimal effort. And 1FR just means if you have space, just take the space that is available to you. The next thing I want to do is maybe use a gap of 3, for example. So now we also have a gap. We can take a look if we also have another gap. So we have gap 1, gap 3, but I think 40 pixels is okay for now. So we're going with that design. So right now I would also like to have our content take up 80% of the width of the screen and be centered, but I don't want it to take up all the available space like 100% because it's like looks pretty bad to me. So the next thing we are going to do, we have this W minus 80 class, which will say take 80% of the width. So we're going to use that one. And we'll use that one for our modal container as well, I think, like so. And now I will take another div, which will basically wrap this div once again. So I think I have to take all of those divs, and now I create another div, and inside of this div, I will use a flex box to center our item. So I'm going to use class flex and I say justify center, and now we'll take this container that has a width of 80% and we center this container in the middle of our page like so. And as you can see, this really starts to look pretty good in my opinion. So the next thing we want to have is a margin right here. So we are going to go right below our H2 and we are going to say let's use MT of 2, for example. We might have to define another margin, and I think we have to, so we're going to go MT, and let's say we want to have MT of 4, for example, which would equal a margin top of 40 pixels. So let's say MT4, 40 pixels of margin to the top. We're going to save the document, and this is what it looks like. Looks a little bit better, but maybe I'm actually even going to try MT8 to see how this looks. And I somehow think that this looks actually even better to me, but yeah, obviously this is something that comes down to preference. Next up, I would really like to center the content, or I would like to center the paragraph. So I'm going to add the class center right here. And now you can see our text is basically centered, and I'm going to do the same for the other two classes. Well, I'm actually going to leave them and copy and paste them in later, but I think this looks pretty good. So let's style this container for now. Let's say we want to have a slightly bigger margin right above our responsive design header. So we're going to go here, say class MT. We can, for example, use MT4, which we've just defined right now, and this looks actually a little bit better to me. Now for the paragraph, we're going to use the class of MT2, for example. So now we have some margin here as well, but I think maybe we are going to go with MT1. So we need to define this class right. Okay, we have this class twice, so I'm going to remove this MT2 and going to say this MT1, and I say that this one has a margin top of 10 pixels. So now we have this design basically. Next up, I think the heading should be slightly bigger, so I'm going to see what kind of fonts we've already defined by taking a look, and let's say we want to have font medium for that one, and let's say we are going to go with 20 pixels. And now we say that our heading right here has a font MD for medium. So now we have this design basically, and to me this looks pretty cool already. So I'm now going to go and I remove the other divs by doing so. And now I'll take the div that we already have, and I'm actually even going to use a comment to keep track of what is basically what. I'm going to have this modal comment here to separate my sections, and now I'm going to copy this entire section and I'm going to paste it in 3 more times, and now we have this design basically. Obviously it's pretty easy to just replace these images right now. We could, for example, say that we want to have, instead of responsive design, for the second one we want to have performance, then we want to have SEO, and then we want to have whatever, cheap prices, for example. And now we can, for example, say for the second image, let's take /prices rocket, for example. Then for the third one, we're going to take slash SEO. And for the last one, we're going to use slash, let's just go with the performance one, which doesn't make sense, but yeah. And as you can see, this is basically the look we can get from this icon section if you want to generate it yourself. And as you can see, it's obviously also 100% responsive. Today I'll show you how to create those cool flippable cards inside of HTML and CSS. To get started creating our cards, we're going to create a new section, and inside of the section we have our cards. So first of all, for our section, we want to use some padding at the bottom and at the top, and I can use some styles I already have right here, like padding section. And I'm going to use this style to give some padding to the top and some padding to the bottom to our section by pasting class in here. And now we basically have this result right here. So we have some padding, but we don't have a background. So let's go and take a background, for example, by going into our style shield, and let's see, I've got this radial gradient, and I'm going to copy and paste this radial gradient into our card section, for example, container, which we are going to use in a second. So now we have this background. I'm going to use this class and give this class to our card section container, which we have right here. So now we have this gradient background. So now it's time to create our card. So first of all, we can create a div that has the class of card, for example. Inside of this card, we're going to create another div that has the class of inner. And inside of this class inner, we're going to create another div that has the class of front, which is basically the front of our card. And we have another div that has the class of back, which is the back of our card, obviously. So now inside of our front, let's say we have an H3 tag, for example, that says basic plan. So we could, for example, list the plans of a web development company. And this is the basic plan. And we could probably say the same on the back of the card, but you could obviously change that according to your needs. And now we also have a paragraph that has, for example, like 10 words. And we're going to use the same paragraph for the back of our site, but maybe we say back of basic plan, so we see a difference. And now, once we go into our section, we have our basic plan and we have the back of our basic plan. So this looks pretty terrible, to be honest. So I'm going to style our card container, if you want to say so, by saying .card, and I'm going to define a width of 500 pixels. And this is just a standard width that we are going to delete later on once we put our cards into a grid, but for now we keep this width to really see how it looks like. So we're going to use a background of white, and now I take this white background and I say I want to have 0.1% opacity, so it looks basically like this. And to really create this glass morphism effect, we are now going to use backdrop filter of blur of 10 pixels. And now we have this blur effect, which is really subtle, so you might not even see it, but yeah, that's how it works. Let's say our card has a border radius of 15 pixels, so we get this slight border radius. And now let's also say we want to have padding of maybe 40 pixels as well, like so. So now we have these cool paddings between our content and our card. Now we can also add a border of 1 pixel solid white to create a slight white border. And maybe we're going to change card to .front and .back, because we want to have the same look for our back and the front of our card. So now we have those cards basically. Obviously we need to hide one card when the other card is visible and vice versa. So let's go to our .inner element and define a basic style that says back face visibility of hidden. So once it basically shows the back face, we want to have it hidden, and once it shows the front face, we want to have it visible. But I think we should probably add back face visibility to our front and our back, because that makes a little bit more sense. But we're going to use this .inner class, which basically wraps our front and our back as well later on. So now let's go and say that our .back has a transform rotate property of 180 degrees, and we can say rotate Y. And as you can see, now our card is basically invisible, so the back of our card is invisible because our card is rotated by 180 degrees. Obviously, if you rotate a paper by 180 degrees, it means that you see the back of the paper. Since we have back face visibility to hidden, we can't see the back of our paper, if you want to say so, or of our card, because it's basically the back and we don't see the back. And this is how it works. And now we could, for example, say that we are going to rotate .inner once the user hovers over the card. So let's say .card : hover. So once the user hovers over the card, we are going to change something for the .inner style. And we say we want to have transform of rotate of, again, 180 degrees. And as you can see, now that we hover over the card, we have the basic plan right at the right of our screen. So it looks pretty weird, but we'll fix that just in a second. Inner has a position of relative, and now our front and our back have both a position of absolute, and it looks pretty weird, as you can see. So let's say we give position relative to our .card, and we'll also give the width to our card. Front and back take up 100% of that width, and we want to have position absolute and inset of 0, which basically means take up all of this available space. So now we're actually going to create a grid by putting our card, which is basically everything right here, inside of a class that has the class.grid, and inside of this grid we have 2 cards for now. And now this .grid class is something that we've already defined right here, so it basically just says display grid. And now we are also going to use grid auto, which basically says grid template columns repeat auto fit min max 250 pixels 1fr, which basically means that the minimum value of our card is 250 pixels of width, and otherwise it's 1fr, so it basically takes up the available space. So once the card would be smaller than 250 pixels, our items are basically going to wrap into the next line. And autofit, yeah, just means take as many columns as you need. So let's go right here. We've copied that class, and instead of our grid template, we are also, going to add grid auto like so. And now we basically have this grid that includes 2 cards. Now we can also remove width of 500 pixels for our card, since we don't need this. It will take up the available space anyways. And now it basically looks like this. Once you hover over the card, we get this flip effect. So now the first mistake I've basically made is I need to use rotate Y instead of just rotate. And now we basically get this rotate effect that looks a lot better already. Obviously, we now have this random effect where it's basically mirrored the text once we have the back of our card. So we're going to go into .inner, which is the container that contains our front and our back right here. So inner contains front and back. And inside of this inner class, we use transform style, and we say preserve 3D, which keeps the 3D transformation into account. Now we can also say that once we go into our .inner transform state, basically our hover state, let's use a transition of all of 0.5 seconds of ease, for example. And now once we hover, we basically have this cool flip effect. It would also make sense to use a perspective of 1000 pixels, which will make the effect look basically a little bit more 3D, and this is the effect that we have right now. So let's go ahead and style our card. Let's say our font right here first of all is white, and the same obviously goes for the paragraph right here. So now we have this effect, and now for this grid we are going to take the entire grid. We'll delete the grid, and we'll say that we have another div, and inside of this div we have this grid, and this grid should only take up 80% of the available space. So we're basically going to say W minus 80, which says 80% of the space is available, which is a class that we will have right here. So with 80%. And let's now say that we want to have class flex and justify center as classes for this repetitive, basically, to center this 80% big div in the center. And now this is what it looks like. Obviously, it would also be pretty cool to have a gap of 3, for example, gap -3, which should be 30 pixels, I think. We're going to save the document. And my mistake is that we need this gap 3 right here for our grid, basically. So now we have this gap as well. And now we have those cards, which still look pretty terrible. As you can see, our padding does not work on every single border, so we can basically delete it right here. And we're going to save the document, and now we have this effect, which is basically not what we're looking for. So what we can do is we're going to go into our card. We say that we want to have an aspect ratio for our card of maybe 1:1, so we have a square. Now we'll also add our padding again, and now we can say that this inner div should take up 100% of the height, and obviously this front and back should take up 100% of the height as well. So now this is what it looks like. Obviously this might be a little bit too big for some of you, so what we can do is set an aspect ratio of maybe 3:1. So now we have width 3, height 1. And this is how this card can basically look like. Obviously it still looks pretty terrible. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a second button, or we are going to add a button or badge, if you want to say so, overall, and we could use this badge to display the price to a user, for example. Let's say $99.99 for the first item, and let's say we give this one a class of badge and minus white. So now we have a white badge. Let's say this white badge gets some styling in here, and we probably want to have a background of white, a color of black, padding of 10 pixels top bottom and 40 pixels left right. And now we can say we want to have a border radius of 30 pixels. So now we basically have this badge. Let's also add that we want to use a max width of fit content. So now it fits our content. So now we have this badge, which also looks pretty cool. So we can also give our badge an M2 by using M-2 as class, for example. So now we should have 20 pixels of margin, maybe M1 is better, 10 pixels of margin. So now we have this badge. Now we're also going to use a color of a class of white, which will give us the color white, and we're going to do the same for our paragraph. So now we have those classes right here, and obviously you could have some more text for the basic plan, but this is nothing we really need right now. So let's just copy those elements to the back of our page, and let's say basic plan back page. And obviously you could do a lot more right here, it doesn't really matter, but as you can see, we now have this card flip effect. Obviously this card like here doesn't look too great, but once we add some more cards, this could really start to look pretty cool in my opinion. So we're going to delete this card, and we'll take the first card that we have right here, and let's just duplicate this card 4 times, for example. And once our grid starts to do its job, it should start to look really good. And obviously for these types of cards, it wouldn't make sense to go for a different aspect ratio. So what we are going to do is we say aspect ratio of 1:1, for example. So now we basically have those cards. We can flip them to the back. We can also obviously change the content if we wanted to. And now once we change the width of our elements of our page, it will adjust since it is obviously responsive, as you can see. So once the screen gets kind of small, one of the cards flips down. Once it gets smaller, 2 of the cards flip down, and once it gets even smaller, 3 of the cards start to flip down. And obviously we could also add some more text right here, because Right now it looks pretty flat, so we could, for example, say, let's add some text right here, 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 and here. And now we have those cards. It would be pretty cool to maybe also have an H2 at the top, which could say our plans. And now we could also just copy our plans from the heading that I have already created at the top right here. So I'm going to just copy and paste those class names. In here, obviously, you can style this as much as you want. And I take the class right here, and this is the result now. I'm also going to add white right here. And for this div, I'm going to use mt-8, which should be 80 pixels margin. And now we have this result. And I think this modal section looks really cool. And obviously you could have different things on the front and on the back of the page, like we just have a different title, but you could obviously also change them a lot and adjust them according to your needs if you wanted to. So I added some placeholder text for those cards, but we could also maybe make our text a little bit bigger. So on the front page and on the back page, we could, for example, say that this one has a font of large, for example. Let's see how this one looks. And now I think it already looks a little bit better. And maybe we can say MT of maybe 2 right here as well. So now we also have a gap. And I think this looks a lot better already. And now we could basically just take this card and let's delete that and let's paste 2 more cards in, or 3 more cards. So now we basically have those plans. Obviously we have the exact same text now again, so I'm going to change that again now. And as you can see, we now have our basic plan, our standard plan, our premium plan, and our pro plan. And obviously you can design those cards however you want and make them look a little bit cooler. Today I'll show you how to create this team section inside of HTML and CSS on mobile, as you can see right here. Now let's start to create the team section. So first of all, we are obviously going to create a section that includes the content for our team, and we can use some of the classes I've already created, like the padding. I'm going to search for it, padding or dot padding section class that gives a padding of top of 80 pixels and a padding of bottom of 80 pixels. I'm going to copy and paste this class in here. Now we have 80 pixels top, 80 pixels bottom, and this is what our section looks like. We can also just copy an H2 from the stuff that we've already done just to get a cool heading. Basically, this is our card section container, but I'm going to probably copy this H2 right here and I'll paste it into our section. And this one has the class font LG, so basically large font, and center, which centers the text. So now we have this heading here. Next up, we again want to create a div that basically has a team member inside of it. So I'm going to give it a class of team minus member probably. And inside of here, I'll have an image. That image is going to link to the images folder and say, okay, let's get profile 1. And down there, I'm going to use H3 and I'm going to give her a name. Maybe this is Catherine, whatever. And now once I save, we basically have this girl and Catherine, whatever is her name. So next up, let's go ahead and say that we have a paragraph below and maybe she's the head CEO or whatever. So now it looks like this. Still looks pretty bad. So I'm going to add a class that says circle. We don't have this class yet, so I have to create this class. I'm going down and I'm going to create .circle as a class, which has a border radius of 50%. Once I save the document and I'm going to save the style shield as well, we should actually see that change, but it doesn't happen because I have this .circle class applied to our div, which obviously doesn't make sense. I need to apply it to our image, and now we have this circular image, if you want to say so. So now let's also use the direction of flex and flex column, and let's use items or align items center, for example, to center our items. And now we have this effect. Let's take a look at items center. Item center basically just aligns our items to the center. And now we obviously need to create a width for our image. So let's say profile is another class, and let's go to dot profile. We got to scroll pretty much here. And once we are at the bottom, we are going to create dot profile as a class, and we say we want to have a width of 250 pixels, for example. So now we have this card, if you want to say so. And obviously it would be cool if this one would be slightly bigger and this one would be slightly smaller. So we can go to our font section, dot font, and we have font medium that gives us a font size of 20 pixels. So we could, for example, use font minus medium for our H3, and now we have this slightly bigger font. And we could also create a font minus SM for small class that has probably a font size of 15 pixels. And now we're going to use font SM for the class down below. Now we have this effect, and now we maybe want to have some margin on the top by giving our heading an M2 of 20 pixels. We're going, whoops, this one is obviously the wrong thing. Okay, we have a class already. That was my bad. We're going to use MT of 2. Now we have this margin to the top, and maybe MT of 1 is already enough. So this is the effect we have now. Obviously you can create cooler cards if you want to, but I think this looks pretty much alright to me. So now I'm going to create some more team members, since obviously most websites have more than one person inside of the team. So let's say we have 2 more team members. Let's say one of them is profile 1, one of them is profile 2, one of them is profile 3, one of them is profile 4. And this is Max Big, this is Brian Chat, and this is whatever. And now we have those 4 guys, and all of them can be head CEO. One of them could, for example, also be designer. One of these guys could be burger maker, and the last one could be I don't know. Last one could be sprinter, for example, for whatever reason. But yeah, you can make whatever you want. And now we obviously need to create a grid to have those items inside of a grid, to make them mobile friendly and to display them next to each other. And we are going to do the same we've done a couple of times already. We are going to create a div. Inside of this div, we'll have our items, and we give this div the class of grid and the class of grid auto. And to remind you again, our class.grid creates display of grid, and grid minus auto creates grid template columns, repeat, auto fit, min max, 250 pixels, 1FR. So if space is available, it will take up the available space. If you shrink the window, once the item reaches 250 pixels or below, it's basically going to wrap the next items into the next row. So this basically makes everything mobile friendly again. And now we have those items next to each other. So now we have those items basically aligned next to each other. Obviously, if I'm going to shrink the window, you can see that it will shrink them as well. And once they reach a certain width, they are going to wrap into the next line. And same goes for the other one. And obviously this doesn't look perfect right now because it's responsive, but it's responsive and looks terrible. So let's also add a gap of 3, for example, which is a gap of 30 pixels between our items. So once we shrink now, we basically get this gap between the items, which looks a lot better already. And one thing I also want to add is a margin between heading and those items. And maybe a margin of 80 pixels would look pretty cool or pretty good. So let's say right here we also have MT of 8, for example. So 80 pixels. And now we have this margin. And this is what our teams could look like, but I also think it would be cool if it would just take up 80% of the entire width and not 100%. So what we can do in order to do so is we create another wrapper container. Instead of this wrapper container, we have our entire content. We say that this grid just has a width of 80% by using W minus 80, which says with 80%. And now again, we use a class of flex of justify of center again to center this 80% pixel container, 80% container in the center of the screen. So let's take a look at this. And this is what it looks like. And I think this looks a lot better already. And this is how you create this kind of theme section in HTML and CSS. Today I'll show you how to create this glass morphism contact form inside of HTML and CSS, where you can type in a name, a topic, a message, and press the send button if you wanted to. To get started creating a contact form, we create another section, and inside of the section we can create a form, which is basically our contact form. We could also add a heading, for example, above our contact form that says, for example, contact us or whatever, and we can put this heading also inside of our contact form. Now let's also give our section a background color by giving it a class that says contact form section, for example. Now we'll take this class, we go into CSS, and we'll scroll down. I have a couple of styles here already, and let's target our contact form section. Let's give it a background color. I've already used this background color a couple of times, so I'm going to just copy and pasting it in. You can also just copy those colors once again, and now we basically right here have our contact us page. Now I'm also going to use dot padding section again, which has a padding of top of 80 pixels and a padding of bottom of 80 pixels. So I'm going to take that class and paste that in here as well. So now we should have some padding top and bottom and our contact us form. First of all, I'm going to remove the center class right here because I don't want this to be centered. And now I'm going to add some classes or one class to our form, which is basically the form container. And now I'm going to take this form container to style our form. I'm going to go down inside of our style sheet, going to target dot form container. I'll give it a padding of 40 pixels, a background of white, but I'm going to change the background color, or to be precise, I'm going to change the background opacity or transparency to 0.1. And now we have this effect already, which is basically somewhat a glass effect. Now I'm also going to change the width to 500 pixels for now, and now I'm also going to give it a border radius of 10 pixels and a backdrop filter of blur of 10 pixels. So now we basically have this effect. Now I want my contact form to be in the center, obviously, so I'm going to use a div that surrounds our form, and I give this div a class of flex and a justify center to center our items. And now our contact form is centered. The next thing I'm going to do is adding some form fields. So the first thing I have is an input of type text, and that one could, for example, be the name, the ID could be name, and the placeholder text could be name as well. I'm going to duplicate that text field, and the second field could, for example, be topic, and ID is topic, and placeholder is topic. So the user can define a topic, for example. And the third field is a text area that just defines a text area, and the text area could, for example, say that this is the message and has the name message. So now we have those three fields. Obviously they look terrible right now, so we have to style them. And we can do so by using our form container class. And instead of this form container class, we are going to target our inputs, and we'll say that we have a background of white, but we are actually just going to use a transparent background of RGBA 255, 255, 2550. So the background is transparent. Now we are going, or let's say we use 0.1 for the background, so it's almost transparent but not fully transparent. Let's use padding top bottom 10 pixels, left right maybe 15 pixels. Now we have this effect right here, width of 100%, border of 0, outline of 0. So we have this effect right now. Let's also target our placeholder by using the same target of input by colon placeholder. Target a placeholder, and we say this one has a color of white, but again, pure white is probably not ideal, so we are going with 0.8 for the transparency, so it's more or less a form of gray. I need to remove this dot right here. I'm going to save the document, and now we have this effect. Now let's maybe add a border radius, or you can leave it like that, whatever you prefer. In my case, I'm going to say, okay, let's use a border radius of 30 pixels, so we have rounded borders like so, and maybe some more padding to the top. So let's probably just go with 15 pixels into all directions like so. And now let's also add a flex to our let's also just add flex to our class, to our form class. So we'll add flex, which is basically just again the class dot flex that we've defined here that sets display to flex, and we might also need flex column, which sets the flex direction to column. So now we basically have the same layout, but we have it in a flex box, and this gives us the opportunity to use a gap. And I have some predefined classes here that create a gap of 40 pixels in this case. So let's take a look at that, but that's probably a little bit too much, so I'm going to use gap 1, or I'm going to create gap 2, and gap 2 will have 20 pixels, and I'm just going to test what looks better. But I think gap 1 might actually be enough in this case. So now we have 10 pixels of gap between our name and our topic, and now we should probably also start to style our text area. Obviously we can do so by going down instead of our style shield first of all, and then let's say that we're going to do the same for our dot form container text area and see how this one looks. So now we have this effect basically, but I think it could probably look slightly better if we would change some things. So we're just going to copy this one, we paste it down here, and now we'll copy all of those effects once again, we'll paste them in here, and now let's say that we have a height of maybe 200 pixels, because usually the text area is a little bit bigger, and like so we have a slightly bigger text area. Obviously we also need a placeholder for the text area, so we say send us a message ... and now we obviously also need to style that one by, for example, using the same effects for placeholder of the text area. Placeholder, and now we have the same effect, so our color should be white as well, but it does not seem to work because we don't have a dot right here, and now it should work. So now we basically have sent as a message, topic, and whatever, but you can see the text is still black, and this is something that we have to change as well by using color of white, and obviously the same for the text area. And now we should have white color inside of our input fields as well. So now we probably need a submit button as well, and we can add one by creating a button of type submit, and we can, for example, say send message, for example. And now we'll give this button a class button white, for example, and we'll take a look at what this looks like. Obviously right now it looks completely terrible, so we are going to target dot button white. We say we want to have padding top bottom 10 pixels, left right 40 pixels, border radius 30 pixels, border of 0, color of black, and let's take a look at what this looks like. So this is basically the button, and obviously we can also say width is min content to make it fit the content. And like so, it somehow doesn't look too good because we have those lines separated, so we're going to use white space no wrap as well. And now we have this send a message button. I think it could look better if we have some more padding to the top, so I'm going to use that. And let's also add a cursor of pointer to have a pointer right here. And by doing so, you basically have this basic content form where you can add your name, like my name is Pascal, topic, I maybe want to get a website, and then you can message some stuff if you wanted to. Obviously, you could add as many fields as you wanted to. You could also add an upload, a file section, whatever, but yeah, that's obviously up to you. I really hope this helped you to create this contact us form, and yeah. Today I show you how to create this footer inside of HTML and CSS. So let's keep going by creating the footer for this website. First of all, we obviously need to have some paragraphs, for example, or some links inside of our section. And let's say we want to have 3 sections. So first of all, I target our footer and I give our footer a background color so we can see the footer. And I'd say that we want to have a background of maybe RGB 26, 26, 26, which should be some form of light gray. Now I'm also going to use the class padding section, which gives us some padding top and some padding bottom. But maybe I'm going to create a new padding for the footer, because I think maybe 80 pixels is a little bit too much for the footer. So I'm going to use padding footer, and I say we have padding top of 40 pixels and padding bottom of 40 pixels. And now we copy the class padding footer and we give this class to our footer. And now we should also already be able to see the background. And as you can see, this is our footer. Obviously it's not done yet, but we'll get there. So let's create 3 divs, because my idea is I want to have a div at the left with some links, in the middle with some links, and at the right with some links. So let's start by creating an anchor tag, and inside of this anchor tag we can, for example, say home. Let's copy this a couple of times. Obviously we are not just going to use home, but home makes sense for now. So what we're going to do now is we give this anchor tag a class that has the class white and underline none. And as you can see, this turns the text to white, non-underlined text, because I have this classes white right here instead of our style sheet where we just set the color to white, and underline none sets the text decoration to none. So this is how those CSS classes work. So again, let's paste this in right here. And now let's say for this div we use class of flex, which is also a class I defined that creates a flex box again. And now we set our flex direction, flex to column basically. So we use flex column to set the flex direction to column, and now we have this effect basically. Obviously doesn't really look too good, so we might actually use center or text center. I think that was the class, maybe it wasn't the class. Let me take a look. Center makes text align center. So let's see if this works. So we have home, let's say we have about, let's say we have contact, let's say we have mission, let's say we have team, whatever. It doesn't really matter too much as well. We just want to have some placeholder here. So now we have those forms right here, and let's say we also want to add a gap of 1, which would also be around 10 pixels right here. Now we have this first div with some hrefs basically. So now let's just take this container. We are going to copy and paste this container twice, and here you can basically say anything. You could say web development, and as you can see, I now created all of those anchor tags, and now we're going to put all of those anchor tags inside of another div. And inside of this div, we use a class of flex, but this time we want to have all of those divs next to each other. So it basically looks like this. So now let's say we want to have justify center to center our content. So now they're all centered, but I also want to have a pretty big gap between the content. So I'm going to use gap 3, might not be enough. So I basically go ahead and create a gap that is a lot bigger by saying, okay, where's our gap? Gap 2, 3, let's create a gap 5, for example, and say that gap here is, for example, 60, or let's say gap 6, which makes more sense with the units. And now we have 60 pixels of space between if we change 3 to 6. So now we have this effect. Maybe this is still not enough, so I'm going to say dot gap 10 with a gap of 100 pixels. And obviously you can change this according to your needs, so I don't have to follow my layout, but this would be an option, for example. Obviously another option instead of using a gap would just be to use justify between, like so. So now we have this effect, and we could also just say, okay, we have justify between right here. Let's just create this entire div and wrap it with another div. We say class flex right here and justify center right here. And now we use a width of 80% for this container, and we center this container that takes up 80% of the width, and we have this effect basically. Obviously you could also say justify around, and now we would have this effect. And as you can see, it's also responsive to a certain degree. So once we get smaller, it basically adapts to the screen width. And at a certain point, I can't really get any smaller, but at a certain point we obviously would need to add a breakpoint. Now to finish a project, let's make this page responsive and make our contact or navigation bar work, to be fair. And first of all, to make our navigation bar work, we need to create different IDs for our different sections. So the first section is obviously our contact section that we can give an ID or assign an ID to. So let's say here the ID is contact. Now let's scroll up, and we basically have our team section here. So we're going to give this one an ID of team, for example. Let's keep scrolling upwards, and now we basically have our batches. So we can create an ID for this section that says, for example, web dev. And then once we scroll up, this is actually also somewhat a web dev section, so we're just going to ignore this one. And now we basically have all of our and now we have our links right here. And maybe we should add another link for our above web dev that basically says plans, for example. And now we can assign a plans ID as well for this section. So now we basically have our plans, which should be this section, web dev, which should be this section, team, which should be this section, and contact, which should be this section. So maybe we should actually change or exchange plans and also our web dev section, because web dev comes above. So let's move plans down, and now let's say we have hashtag web dev for the web dev section. We have hashtag plans for the plans section, hashtag team for the team section, and hashtag contact for the contact section. Because we obviously used an ID to reference the sections we want to scroll to once the user clicks on the icon. And now by saying hashtag contact, it basically says move to the section that has an ID of contact. This here should basically be the web dev section, and right below we should probably say that the next section is, and this section is our plans section, or plan section. Now we're going to save this, and now we say web dev is the first section, which is this one. So let's click web dev. We are going to this section. Plans, we're going to this section. Team, we're going to this section. Contact, we're jumping to this section. Obviously the scrolling behavior is not optimal, so we're going right here and say that we want to have scroll behavior of smooth, which will add a smooth scrolling behaviors. So web dev, we are basically jumping there. Plans, we are jumping there. Team, we are jumping there. And contact, we are jumping there. And we have a smooth transition, which is pretty nice. So now let's work on making this website responsive, and we can probably say that we add a class that says display none MD, for example. So we say dot display none minus MD, which sets the website to display block, which is just normal. And now we're going to add a media query that says add media screen and max width of probably 700 pixels. We are going to take a look when we need to add this media query, and once we hit this display width, we are going to use dot display none MD, and we are going to say display none once we basically reach a width of below 700 pixels. So let's take a look. I'm going to open the inspector to really see the width of our page. And as you can see, our page looks good, our page looks good, our page looks good. Now it's actually already starting to look pretty bad. So maybe I even call this one LG for large, because this is probably a pretty large breakpoint. And I think, yeah, at this point, it probably does not really make too much sense to have those things next to each other anymore, because it, yeah, actually just looks trash to me. And I think it would be better. Like, that content is also like not that important. If you don't see this text, it doesn't really matter too much. So I want to have the behavior that once we are below 1300 pixels, I want to just remove this item and this item from the flow of the website. So we're going to do so by using display none LG, and we add this one to, first of all, the div that basically wraps our left section, and the div that basically wraps our right section. And right now, as you can see, below 1300 pixels, those items are gone, and above they basically reappear. And this is the effect. Obviously, I also want to increase the size of our laptop once our screen gets smaller. So that's the next thing we are going to do. So let's take a look at our style sheet. We should have this laptop class, which has a width of 35%. But as we decrease the size of our screen, so probably at 1300, we could add the first breakpoint and say, okay, now let's have a width of maybe just 500 pixels. So now it basically looks like this, because yeah, we don't really have text, so it makes a lot of sense to like just have a bigger screen. And once we get to maybe a width of, let's say, 800 pixels, so we're just going to create a second media query and max width colon 800 pixels. Now we're just going to say, okay, our laptop should probably keep to have 300 pixels. So as we decrease the size, our laptop gets slightly smaller. And now we have this effect. And there barely exist any devices, I would say, below 350 pixels. So we'll actually cover that one as well. But that will probably be the last breakpoint that makes any sense to consider. So we're going with 200 pixels right here. And as you can see, it still looks kind of right. But in real life, you won't really have any devices that will have this small of a screen. So maybe we are going with 400, I'd say. And we'll have 240 pixels right here. And this is what it looks like. The next element we want to adjust is our H1. So we are now going to take a look at our H1, and once it basically starts to look bad. So as you can see, up to probably 900 pixels, it looks pretty good, but right below it really starts to, yeah, probably not look perfect anymore. So yeah, okay, let's see. Probably we should just use this breakpoint as well, so 800 pixels. And I'm probably going to target this H1 by using an ID selector, because this ID selector has a higher specificity, so I can do so by saying website title. And by using this one, I'm going to override font XXL later on. So I'm going to use point followed by website title, and I say font size of 40 pixels once I reach 800 pixels. So let's take a look at this. So once we get below 800 pixels, this should override our font size, but it somehow does not seem to do so. So we somehow seem to not be able to target the tile because of a dot right here. So we need a hashtag, obviously, and now it seems to work. So 40 pixels is probably a little bit too small. So I'm going to go with 60 pixels to start with. And now we have this effect, and I think it still looks pretty cool. Now we can go smaller, smaller, smaller. And I think at probably 600 pixels, it starts to look pretty bad. So I'm going to add another breakpoint at 600 pixels. Probably don't need the laptop anymore. And now I'm going to decrease the size to 40 pixels for this device. And as you can see, now it works until we basically reach, let's say, 400 pixels. Then we probably need to make it smaller once again. And we can say, okay, now let's just use 30 pixels. Or let's just remove this one and let's see how it looks once the line wraps into the next line. And I think this looks pretty much alright as well. So I'm probably even going to go with this one. So let's take a look at our page in total. So up to this point, it looks pretty good. But I would say once we get to approximately, let's say 800 pixels, it starts to look a little bit worse. So at 800 pixels, we probably should go with 400 pixels for our laptop. And now we have this effect, and I think it still looks pretty good. And once we hit 600 pixels, web development gets smaller, but I think this might also not be the best option. So I'm just going to keep font size at 50 pixels. And now our text should just wrap into a new line once we hit a certain width. And I think at 500 pixels, we should add another breakpoint for our laptop. So we're going to do so. We copy this one. We say we want to have 500 pixels. We want to adjust our laptop's width. And we are going to go to maybe 300 pixels. And now we have this effect. And I would also like to add some margin top of maybe again 100 pixels. And now our laptop is slightly more centered, which looks a little bit better to me. And now we basically have this effect. And I think it's also a little bit too small once we get below 400. So we'll probably say, let's stay at 270 pixels of size. And now it looks like this. You gotta say also most devices are slightly bigger than this, so we are really optimizing for very old devices right here. This is not something that is like super important, but yeah, if you have the choice, just do it and try it. Obviously I could also add a container that just limits the width of the heading to 80%, and maybe I'm just going to do this very quick. So I add this container and I'm going to put the H1 inside, and I give this one a mobile heading container, and under normal circumstances this container will just have a width of 100% like so. But once we reach a certain size, this container will keep to have a width of 80% and a margin of auto to center our heading. And as you can see now, our text starts to wrap a little bit earlier, so it wraps into a new line before it hits 100% of the width. Maybe below 400 pixels, we should also decrease the size once again of our website title to maybe 40 pixels. And I think then we are good to go right here. So as you can see, 350 pixels is really the minimum I would consider. Once we go up, it still looks good, it looks good, it looks good, it looks even better. And right here it really starts to look great. So let's continue to adjust our animation, or let's continue to adjust our navbar for mobile. And the first thing I actually want to do is remove the logo once we hit a certain size, because the logo is actually not really necessary for the purpose of this website. Obviously it's cool to have, but if we don't have the space, we're just going to remove it. So I'm basically going to remove this ID because we don't really need it, and I use a class of logo. And now I'm going to add this class of logo to a media query that basically removes the logo once we, let's take a look, once we reach a width of probably anything below 1000 pixels, the logo becomes really unnecessary. So let's use a media query and say add media screen and max width 1000 pixels. We're going to target the .logo class, and we use display none once we are below 1000 pixels. And as you can see, the logo basically just disappeared. And the next thing I would like is basically have our navbar centered in the middle. So what I'm going to do now is I'll go to our navbar and I'll use an ID to create a higher specificity. And I'm going to say that this is the nav minus bar. And right here, I also use an ID that says nav bar container. And I'm going to use this nav bar container once we reach 1000 pixels by doing so. And I say justify content, let's center the content. So now our navbar is basically centered. And it keeps to work now for a while. So up to probably, let's say, yeah, 800 pixels is kind of right, but then it really starts to break. And I think the first thing we should remove is basically this border. Obviously, it's kind of cool, but it's not really necessary on mobile, and it takes up a lot of spot. We have a lot of space. We have a lot of padding here for our several classes. So right here, I'm going to add an ID to our links, which says ID equals nav minus link. And now I obviously have to create several links to create a higher specificity. Navlink 1, navlink 2, navlink 3, and navlink 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we need to create different navlinks. The first thing we want to do once we reach anything below 800 pixels is basically target our nav links. So we're going in here, we say hashtag nav minus link 1, and I just copy this one here and I'm going to paste it in a couple of times for all of the nav links. And now we have the 5 nav links, and now we can say padding left 0, padding right 0. Nothing happens because I think I have a typo right here. It should obviously be nav link and not nav links. I'm going to save it once again, and now as you can see, this here is entirely removed, and now our content also seems to work until we basically reach 350 pixels. And now I also want to say, obviously this here looks terrible, so we have to remove this surrounded border, if you want to say so. And we have this one for our first nav link, and I think we did it by using href equals. So we have to target this one once we reach a certain size, and I think the size should actually be once we reach 800 pixels. So once we reach 800 pixels, we already have this media query, so we just have to target our element that fixes the issue. So once we hit 800 pixels, we want to remove this background to none. Color shouldn't be black, obviously, color should still be white. Border radius should be 0. So now this is basically removed as well. And now let's make our navbar slightly smaller, and we basically get this effect up to 380 pixels. Now let's just take this ID of navbar and let's go into our media queries and say once we reach a max width of 600 pixels, let's just decrease the font size to 12 pixels because this will probably be the easiest way. This is maybe a little bit too small, so we're going with 14 pixels, and we just adjust our page so that it basically starts to look good once we have at least 350 pixels. And I think this looks pretty cool. So we could probably even go to 15 pixels and see if this works. As you can see, 15 pixels for a viewport width of 350 pixels still works. And I really recommend to optimize for devices at above 350 pixels, because anything below doesn't really matter too much anymore. And once we scroll down, this is how it basically would look on your mobile device. Obviously, you could change a lot more if you wanted to, but I think this works for me. We have this section. All of this is obviously already optimized because we used grid from the beginning, and our contact form is probably not perfect yet. So we are going to adjust our contact form by taking a look at our HTML and see how our contact form basically looked. So this is our contact form section. So let's go into CSS and take a look. So we basically have this form container which has a width of 500 pixels. So this is what we basically need to adjust once we hit anything below probably 500 pixels. So let's go in, let's target the form container, and I think once we have a max width of 600 pixels, not 500, we should probably start to shrink our container. So right here we have basically 590, and right now I think it would make sense to go to a width of 400 pixels like so. And as you can see, now it looks a little bit better. Once we hit 500 pixels, it would probably make sense to go down to 300 pixels. And now let's take a look. And this is what it looks like on devices that have 350 pixels. And I think it still looks pretty good. So now again, we can say or go up and say that we want to create another class for our footer and say .footer display none. And under normal circumstances, we have display block because we obviously want to display something. Display block. And once we reach a certain size, which is probably around 450 pixels, we want to remove this and this section basically. So usually if you create this website, the items in the center should be the most important ones, and the other ones can be there because they have probably some information, but they are not really that useful. Otherwise, you can obviously align them vertically, but under these circumstances, I don't really think that it's necessary. So we're going to add footer display none to our footer, and to be precise, to our second and our third class. And once we get a screen width of below 500 pixels, we are going to set display to none. And as you can see, now it basically looks like this. And I think this looks really good. And once we have a certain width, we get them back again. Probably I shouldn't set this to display block, but rather just leave this away because we should have a display already. And now it looks like this. And as you can see, this is our website on a mobile device. Everything looks perfectly fine. We have those buttons that we can also turn and so on. And everything looks pretty nice.